Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Imagine you wake up tomorrow, and everything is gone. Not just your phone, not just your savings, not just your house. Everything. Your name, your identity, every photograph that proves you existed. The people who call you by the name you've carried your whole life. You are stripped, your clothes taken, your hair shaved, your wedding ring pulled from your finger, and into your forearm, a number is carved, because from this moment forward, you are not a person. You are a number. And here is the question that should stop you cold. In that moment, with absolutely nothing left, would you still have a reason to live? Not a reason handed to you by someone else. Not a distraction. Not a false hope. A real reason. From inside you. Something that cannot be stripped. Cannot be numbered. Cannot be burned. Most of us will never face what Viktor Frankl faced. But every single one of us, every person watching this right now, will at some point stand in a darkness so complete, so absolute, that we cannot see a single step forward. A loss, a betrayal, a diagnosis, a collapse, a moment when everything we built, everything we believed, everything we thought we were, suddenly means nothing. And in that moment, the question is not how do I escape this pain? The question is, Viktor Frankl answered that question, not in a university, not in the comfort of a therapist's chair. He answered it in the most horrific place the human race has ever engineered, the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. And what he discovered there did not just save his life. It became one of the most important ideas in all of human history. Stay with me. This is not a story about death. This is a story about what makes us undeniably, irreducibly alive. Vienna, Austria, 1905. A city of marble and music, of coffee houses where philosophers argued until midnight, of concert halls where Beethoven's ghost still lingered in the rafters. Vienna was not just a city, it was an idea. The idea that the human mind, given freedom and beauty, could reach something transcendent. Into this world, Viktor Emil Frankl was born. Not just into a family, into a tradition of asking the hardest questions. By the time Viktor was a teenager, he was already corresponding with Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis himself. Freud was so impressed that he personally arranged for one of young Viktor's papers to be published in a prestigious journal. Viktor was not yet 20 years old. But even then, something in Viktor pushed back against the giants. Freud believed the deepest human drive was the pursuit of pleasure. Alfred Adler, another titan, believed it was the will to power. Both men saw human beings as creatures fundamentally chasing something: sensation, control, dominance, comfort. Viktor looked at the people around him, his patients, his students, the faces he passed on the street, and he saw something different. He saw people who had pleasure. He saw people who had power. And yet they were hollow, empty. But he began to wonder, what if the deepest human hunger is not for pleasure and not for power, but for meaning? He called his emerging theory logotherapy, from the Greek word logos, which means meaning, the therapy of meaning, the idea that human beings can endure almost anything, any suffering, any pain, any loss, if they have a reason why. He was building this theory carefully, brick by brick, in the quiet of his Vienna clinic, in the lecture halls, in his books. He had a wife named Tilly. He had a loving family. He had a flourishing career. He had, by every measure, a beautiful life. Viktor Frankl was no longer a psychiatrist, no longer a husband, no longer a son, no longer an author. He was prisoner number 119,104. Here is something Viktor observed almost immediately, something that speaks to the terrifying adaptability of the human mind. The first reaction of the prisoners was shock. Pure, electric shock. The body goes cold. The mind goes blank. You cannot process what is happening because your brain has no category for this level of horror. But the second reaction, and this disturbed Viktor deeply, was something almost worse than shock. It was humor. Dark, gallows humor. Men making bitter jokes. Laughing at the absurdity of their situation. Not because it was funny, nothing was funny, but because the human mind, when confronted with the unprocessable, sometimes reaches for laughter as the only available response. Viktor recognized this. As a psychiatrist, he had seen this mechanism before. It was the mind's way of creating distance from a reality too terrible to fully absorb. But he also knew that distance would not last. As the days and weeks unfolded, the prisoners moved through what Viktor would later identify as a psychological progression, almost like stages of a disease. And understanding these stages is critical because they reveal something profound about the human mind under extreme duress. The first stage was the shock of arrival, what Viktor called delusion of reprieve. Even as the cattle cars pulled in, even as the smoke from the crematoriums hung in the air, some part of the human mind refused to believe the worst. Surely this is temporary. Surely there has been a mistake. Surely someone will come. Surely. The second stage arrived when the delusion shattered. Viktor describes a moment shortly after arrival, when a senior prisoner, an older man who had been there longer, pulled him aside. Viktor asked him innocently, "Where do we take our belongings?" The man pointed to a dark column of smoke rising into the gray sky. "There," the man said, "that's where your belongings go. And if you're not careful, that's where you go too." The second stage was apathy. Emotional death before physical death. The feelings, the grief, the outrage, the love, the fear, were simply too enormous for the human nervous system to sustain. So the body did something cruel but necessary. It turned them off. Viktor watched men who had wept uncontrollably in the first days become hollow-eyed and expressionless within weeks. Men who would step over a dying body in the road because they had spent all their available grief. Men who would eat their small ration of watery soup without tasting it. Men who existed but had stopped living. And Viktor made a decision in those early weeks, a decision that took everything he had. He decided to observe. Even here, even in this, he would be a scientist of the human soul. He would watch, not just survive, but watch and understand. Because he believed, even then, even surrounded by evidence to the contrary, that what he was learning had value. That someday, somehow, it would matter. Let me tell you what a day looked like. Wake up at 4 a.m. to the sound of whistles and shouting. Scramble out of wooden bunks, 3 or 4 men per bunk, crammed together like stacked wood, sharing a single thin blanket. March in the dark to morning roll call, Appell, in German, where prisoners stood in lines to be counted. If the count was wrong, if anyone had died in the night, if someone had fled, the entire group stood there. In the dark, in the cold, for hours, until the number was right. Then, a march to the work site, often miles away, through snow and ice and mud, in shoes that were either too large or too small, because shoes were distributed randomly. Viktor describes watching men wrap their bleeding feet in strips of torn cloth, trying to make it one more day. Work was brutal and often senseless. Digging ditches, carrying heavy stones, breaking frozen ground with inadequate tools. Not because the work served a productive purpose, much of it didn't, but because physical exhaustion was itself the goal. A body too tired to think, too tired to organize, too tired to hope. Food, a bowl of watery soup once per day. A small piece of bread, perhaps a few grams of margarine or a spoonful of some unidentifiable paste. This was meant to sustain a human body performing hard physical labor in freezing temperatures. It was not meant to sustain. It was meant to slowly, methodically destroy. The guards were a universe unto themselves. Some were sadistic, cruel in ways that Viktor found almost impossible to put into words. They would beat prisoners for small infractions, or for no infraction at all. They would humiliate, mock, torture. But here, and this is important, here is something Viktor noticed that would later become central to his entire philosophy. Not all guards were monsters, and not all prisoners were saints. There were guards, rare, but real, who would slip a prisoner an extra piece of bread, who would look the other way, who, in small, quiet acts of risk, chose humanity over ideology. And there were prisoners who, in the fight for survival, became predatory, who would steal from weaker prisoners, who would inform on others to gain favor with the guards, who, in the desperate scramble to live, chose survival over decency. Viktor observed all of this and arrived at a conclusion that was both simple and revolutionary. There are only two races of men, the decent and the indecent. They are found in every group, in every society, in every uniform, in every prison and every palace. The Nazis believed they had reduced these men to animals. And in many ways, the physical conditions were exactly what you would use to reduce any creature to its most basic instincts. Cold, hunger, fear, exhaustion. But Viktor was watching something the Nazis had not accounted for. He was watching men make choices. Tiny choices in impossible conditions. Whether to give your last piece of bread to someone weaker. Whether to offer a word of comfort to a man breaking down in the corner. Whether to laugh, actually laugh, at something absurd about the situation, just to remind yourself that your mind was still your own. These choices were small. In the outside world, they would have been invisible. But in here, in the laboratory of extremity that Auschwitz had become, these tiny choices were everything. They were the difference between a man who retained his humanity and a man who lost it. Viktor began to pay close attention to who survived psychologically, not necessarily physically, because physical survival had enormous random components, but who maintained their inner self, who kept their eyes alive even when their body was failing. And he noticed something. The prisoners who deteriorated fastest, psychologically, were not necessarily the weakest physically. They were the ones who lost their sense of future, who could not answer, even in their own minds, the question, why am I enduring this? He remembered a quote from Nietzsche, something he had read years ago in the warmth and comfort of Vienna. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. He had thought he understood that sentence before. He had nodded at it academically, approvingly, the way you nod at a wise saying without truly feeling its weight. Now, in the ice and mud of Auschwitz, he felt it in his bones. Here is what most people don't understand about Viktor Frankl's experience. The Nazis controlled everything. They controlled when he slept and when he woke, what he ate, where he went, what work he did, whether he lived or died on any given day. But there was one thing, one extraordinary, infuriating, indestructible thing that they could not touch. His inner life. Viktor describes moments, and if you've ever wondered whether spiritual experiences are real, pay attention here. He describes moments in the camp that were genuinely transcendent. One morning, marching in the pre-dawn dark toward a work site miles away, stumbling on frozen ground, guards shouting, prisoners coughing, Viktor's mind drifted, involuntarily, to his wife. Not a daydream, not a fantasy. Something more vivid and more real than the mud under his feet. He writes that he felt her presence so completely, her eyes, her voice, the exact particular warmth of her, that the misery around him became somehow distant. He was here in his body in the cold. But another part of him was with her. Untouchable. Undefeated. He writes, and I want you to really hear this. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets and proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and the highest goal to which man can aspire. I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. Let that settle for a moment. In Auschwitz, in the mud, marching toward a day of brutal labor, possibly toward death, a man is thinking about love, not as an escape, but as a foundation, as the ground of everything. He did not know in that moment whether Tilly was alive. He would later learn that she died in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. But in that moment of profound inner contact, the love was real. The connection was real. And it gave him something. It gave him a reason. Viktor also found another source of inner life that sustained him: beauty. Just beauty. In a concentration camp. He describes an evening when prisoners were crowded into their barracks after a long day. Most of them collapsed in exhaustion, when another prisoner rushed in and shouted for them to come outside, quickly. Reluctantly, aching and hollow, they dragged themselves out. The sky was on fire. A sunset of such extraordinary color, deep crimsons, burning oranges, violet clouds reflected in the puddles on the ground, that the prisoners stood in silence, unable to speak. And then someone said quietly, almost to themselves, "How beautiful the world could be." Viktor understood something in that moment that cannot be taught in a classroom. That the capacity for beauty, the ability to be struck silent by a sunset, to feel love for an absent person, to laugh at a dark joke, to compose a poem in your mind while marching to forced labor, these are not luxuries. They are the proof of freedom. The Nazis could imprison the body. They could starve it, beat it, work it toward death. But they could not imprison the capacity to notice a sunset. They could not chain the part of Viktor that looked at the burning sky and felt, against all reason, against all logic, that life contains something worth experiencing. And this is the central revelation of Viktor Frankl's entire philosophy, and it is more radical than it sounds, so I want you to really absorb it. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. This is not a motivational poster slogan. This is a discovery made under conditions of genuine extremity. Viktor Frankl did not read this in a self-help book. He lived it into existence, in real time, in a place designed specifically to destroy it. The guards could determine every external variable of his existence. But they could not determine how he interpreted that existence. They could not reach inside him and tell him what his suffering meant. That space, that tiny, sovereign, extraordinary space, remained his. Boys. Completely. Forever. Viktor Frankl made a profound reframe in those camps, one that most people, even today, struggle to accept. He stopped asking life the question. What do I mean by that? For most of us, our relationship with life is interrogatory. We demand answers. Why is this happening to me? What is the point of this suffering? What does life want from me? What did I do to deserve this? We put life in the dock. We make ourselves the judge and life the defendant. Viktor flipped it entirely. Think about what that means for a moment. If you've lost a loved one, life is asking you, who will you become in the face of grief? What will you carry forward? What will you honor? If you've lost a job, a marriage, a dream, life is asking you, what does this reveal about what actually matters to you? If you are ill or afraid or broken, life is asking you, what is your response? Not what happened to you. What is your response? This is not victim blaming. Viktor was very clear about this, and it's important not to misread him. He was not saying you deserve your suffering. He was not saying everything happens for a reason in some cosmic, pre-planned sense. He was saying something harder and more empowering than that. Regardless of what caused the suffering, regardless of whether it is fair, whether it is deserved, whether it makes any sense at all, you retain the power to choose your response to it. And that power, that choosing is itself a form of meaning. Viktor identified 3 primary pathways to meaning, 3 ways a human being can find a reason that makes suffering bearable. The first is through work, through creating something, achieving something, contributing something. Through your craft, your calling, the unique thing that only you can do or make or offer to the world. The second is through love, through connection with another person. Through giving yourself fully to someone else's existence. Through being needed and needing. Through the encounter that Viktor experienced in the mud, thinking of his wife. The recognition that another soul is real and that their reality enriches yours. The third, and this is the one that applies most directly to the camp, and most directly to the moments of life when the first 2 are unavailable, is through suffering itself. The way you face unavoidable pain. Viktor was very precise here. He was not romanticizing suffering. He was not saying suffering is good. He was saying, when suffering is unavoidable, when there is nothing you can do to remove it, the attitude you take toward it. He describes a man in the camp, an older doctor, who was in profound psychological distress over the death of his wife, who had died before the war. Viktor sat with him and asked, "What would have happened if you had died first and she had survived?" The man went quiet. Then he said, "She would have suffered terribly." Viktor said, "Then by dying first, she was spared that suffering. Your suffering is the price of her freedom from it. Your grief is the meaning of your love for her made visible." The man said nothing, but something in him shifted. Viktor could see it in his face. The suffering had not changed. The loss had not changed. Not a single external fact was different. But the meaning of the suffering had changed, and that changed everything. Let's talk about logotherapy, what it actually is, what it means, and why it is arguably more relevant today than it was when Viktor Frankl developed it in the 1940s. The word comes from the Greek logos, meaning meaning. Logotherapy is, at its core, a psychotherapeutic approach built on a single foundational claim. The primary human motivation is not pleasure and not power, it is the search for meaning. And when that search fails, when a person cannot find meaning in their life, they experience what Viktor called the existential vacuum. The existential vacuum. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Not poverty, not disease, not broken relationships. A vacuum, an absence, the sense that your life, your particular, specific, unrepeatable life, does not add up to anything, that you are performing a role but living no story. Viktor believed this existential vacuum was the defining spiritual crisis of the modern age. And here is the uncomfortable part. He wrote about this crisis in the 1940s and 1950s. In the decades since, by almost every measure, rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, addiction, loneliness, the vacuum has deepened. We are, in many ways, the richest, most entertained, most comfortable generation of human beings in history. We have more options, more information, more stimulation than any previous civilization could have imagined. And we are profoundly, quietly, desperately empty. Viktor saw this coming. He had seen what happened when people, even in the worst conditions imaginable, found meaning. And he had seen what happened when they lost it. He had seen men in the concentration camps who had no physical reason to still be alive, but whose eyes were still present, still engaged, still fighting, not because they had more food or better shoes or kindergartens, but because they had something to live for. A child they needed to return to, a book they intended to finish, a promise they had made, a person they refused to let die without seeing again. And he had seen men who were physically strong, far stronger than Viktor, who was a relatively slight intellectual, simply lie down one morning and not get up. Men who had lost their last reason. Men for whom the future had gone dark. Viktor describes one such prisoner, a man who had had a dream that the war would end on a specific date. That day came. The war did not end, and something in the man simply stopped. Within days, he was dead. Not from starvation, not from beating, not from disease, though disease was the listed cause. Viktor, as a physician, knew what he was seeing. The man had lost his why. And without the why, the body had no argument to make against death. Logotherapy, then, is not primarily a technique. It is a vision of what a human being is. A human being is not a machine optimizing for pleasure, not an ego seeking superiority. A human being is a creature that needs to believe their existence has significance, that their suffering points towards something, that their love matters, that the specific shape of their particular life means something that could not be replaced by any other life. And Viktor's insight was this: that meaning is not something you find already made, waiting for you somewhere out there in the world. It is not a treasure that some people have access to and others don't. It is something you create, or more precisely, something you discover through engagement with your actual life as it actually is. Not the life you wish you had, the life you have. Not after the difficulty ends, but in the difficulty. There is a technique in logotherapy called paradoxical intention. It sounds almost absurd until you understand what it's doing. If a person suffers from severe anxiety about a particular situation, say, a fear of trembling in public, Viktor would instruct them to actively try to tremble as much as possible in that situation. The result? They almost never could, because the anxious focus, the hyperattention to the feared symptom, is itself what produces the symptom. The moment you try to do it intentionally, you detach from the self-reinforcing fear cycle. But there is something deeper here than a therapy trick. The underlying principle is, do not fight your fear with more of yourself. Step outside it, observe it, even laugh at it, because the part of you that can laugh at your fear is bigger than the fear. That is always true. The observer is always bigger than what is observed. Viktor Frankl survived 4 concentration camps. Versailles, Auschwitz, Kaufering, Turkheim. He was liberated by American forces in April of 1945. You might expect that liberation felt like triumph, like a gate swinging open and a man walking into sunlight, reborn. It did not feel like that. Viktor describes the first moments of freedom as deeply strange and disorienting. The prisoners walked out of the camp and stood in a field of flowers, and they could not feel anything. The mechanism that had protected them, the emotional blunting, the apathy, the psychological distance, did not simply switch off because the gates were open. They had spent years learning not to feel, not to hope, not to believe that good things were real. Viktor stood in that field of flowers and tried to feel joy, and he could not. He writes that he walked and walked, alone, talking to nobody, and at some point, something broke open. He fell to his knees in the middle of the field, and he wept. And then he stood up, and he walked on. He did not know yet that he knew only that he was standing in a field, that he was alive, and that somehow, against everything, some version of him that had refused to be destroyed had come through. The psychological reintegration of survivors was its own trial. Viktor observed in himself and in others a phenomenon he called depersonalization, a sense of unreality. The feeling of watching your own life as if from outside it. Some prisoners, when they finally returned home, found their houses occupied by strangers, their family members dead, their former lives simply gone, with no marker or memorial, as if they had never existed. Some of these men, who had survived the impossible, could not survive the return. Having held on through every horror in anticipation of what waited at home, they came home to nothing, and the meaning they had been living on, the future they had been fighting toward, simply evaporated. Viktor recognized this as among the most dangerous psychological moments, the collapse of a forward-pointing meaning, the goal reached but hollow, or the goal destroyed. And yet he chose to rebuild. Within days of liberation, still physically ravaged, he began talking, writing, dictating. The manuscript that had been destroyed when he entered the camps, he would recreate it from memory. The ideas that had sustained him through the worst would now be given to the world. He sat down and dictated the book that became man's search for meaning in 9 days. 9 days. Now let's talk about you. Because Viktor Frankl survived a concentration camp, and you, almost certainly, are reading this in a world that is physically safer, materially richer, and optionally more comfortable than anything he ever experienced. So what possible relevance does his story have to your Monday morning? Let me tell you. The existential vacuum that Viktor described, that hollow, directionless, scrolling at 3 am feeling that something essential is missing from your life, is not a sign of weakness. It is not a symptom of ingratitude. It is a signal. It is your psyche telling you that you are living without a sufficient answer to the question, why? Not what do I want? Not what am I afraid of? Not what do other people think of me? But why does this particular life, your life with its specific contents, relationships, capacities, and limitations, why does it matter? Here is the first lesson Viktor's life teaches us, and it is perhaps the hardest. Meaning is not given. It is found, or made, through engagement. We live in a culture that promises meaning as a product. Buy this car and your life will mean something. Follow this influencer and you'll discover who you really are. Achieve this metric and your existence will be justified. Viktor would look at all of that and say, you are looking in the wrong direction. Meaning is not something you acquire. It is something you respond to. It is something that calls to you from a specific situation, a specific need that only you, with your particular history and capabilities, can address. The calling is already there. In the people around you who need something that you have to give. In the work that only you can do. In the suffering that, if you face it with the right orientation, will teach you something worth knowing. The second lesson, suffering is not the enemy of meaning. Avoided it is, but engaged with, it is often the source. Every meaningful life you have ever admired has been built, in part, through suffering. Every great artist, every great leader, every great parent, every great human being you have ever looked up to, their greatness was not built in comfort. It was built in the furnace of loss, failure, grief, and the choice to continue anyway. This does not mean you should seek suffering. Viktor was not a masochist. He was not saying, go find pain. He was saying, when pain finds you, and it will, the question is not why is this happening to me? The question is what is this asking of me? The third lesson is the most personal and the most demanding. You are responsible. Viktor dedicated the American edition of Man's Search for Meaning to what he called a statue of responsibility, a counterpart to the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast. Because freedom without responsibility, he believed, was not freedom at all. It was license. It was drift. Real freedom is the freedom to choose your response. And with that freedom comes the full weight of responsibility for what you choose. You cannot blame your childhood, your parents, your circumstances, your genes, your bad luck, for what you choose to do with your one irreplaceable life. Those things shaped the conditions, but you choose the response. Boys. In the concentration camp. And in your living room. The fourth lesson, love is not a feeling. Love is a direction. Viktor marching in the dark, experiencing his absent wife as more real than the guards around him, that was not delusion. That was not escapism. That was the activation of the highest human faculty, the capacity to orient yourself toward another being with your full self. In a world increasingly optimized for consumption, for receiving, for taking, for being stimulated, Viktor Frankl's experience is a radical act of remembrance. The deepest human experiences are not received. They are given. Meaning flows toward the person who gives, who serves, who loves. Not as a spiritual reward for virtue, but as the natural structure of how human consciousness works. The self that is turned outward, towards something or someone beyond itself, is the self that discovers it has something worth being. The fifth lesson, and perhaps the most quietly revolutionary: your life is unique, irreplaceable, and therefore, your meaning is unique, irreplaceable. Viktor did not offer a formula. He did not say, "Here are the 5 steps to a meaningful life." He would have found that insulting to the particularity of every human soul. Because your meaning, what your life is ultimately about, what only you can contribute, or create, or love, or endure, is yours. It cannot be outsourced. It cannot be crowdsourced. It cannot be found in a self-help book, including this one. It can only be found by living honestly and responsibly inside your actual life, asking genuinely, not rhetorically, not performatively, but genuinely, what is being asked of me here? Let me bring you back to where we started. That question I asked you at the beginning. If everything were taken, your name, your possessions, your relationships, your future, would there be anything inside you that could not be stripped? Viktor Frankl lived that question, not as a thought experiment, not as a philosophical exercise, as his actual daily reality for 3 years, in conditions that were designed specifically to answer it in the negative. And his answer, paid for in full, earned in blood, and cold, and grief, and the destruction of everyone and everything he loved. His answer was, yes. There is something in the human being that cannot be stripped, cannot be numbered, cannot be marched, beaten, starved, or systematically degraded into non-existence. It is the freedom, small, interior, almost invisible from the outside, to choose what your circumstances mean, to decide, in the face of the unchosen, what you will make of it, to refuse to let your suffering be merely meaningless pain, and insist, even without proof, even without guarantee, that it is pointing towards something. Viktor Frankl was not a saint. He was not superhuman. He was not invincible. He was a man, a frightened, grieving, hungry, exhausted man who had lost almost everything. And he chose, again and again, in the small sovereign space, between what happened to him and how he responded, to remain himself. That is the victory, not survival. Survival was partially luck. The victory was remaining himself. Carrying, through everything, some irreducible core that refused to be made into a prisoner, even inside a prison. And here is what makes this story not just about Viktor Frankl, but about every one of us. You are already being asked to exercise this freedom. Not in a concentration camp, in your life. In the relationship that has worn you down. In the career that has lost its sense of purpose. In the body that is not cooperating. In the grief you carry for someone you have lost. In the dream you set aside, so long ago that you have almost forgotten what it felt like to hold it. Life is asking you a question, right now, today. Not, are you comfortable? Not, are you safe? Not, are you liked? But, who are you choosing to be right now, inside the particular conditions of your particular life? That is the question Viktor Frankl spent his whole life answering. And his answer was extraordinary. Not because of the scale of his suffering, though the scale was almost incomprehensible, but because of the quality of his choosing. He chose again and again to look for what was real and beautiful and worth fighting toward. To let love be his compass even when love was absent. to let meaning be his shelter even when the shelter was thin and cold and barely standing. And he made it through. He made it through. Viktor Frankl lived until 1997. He was 92 years old when he died. He went on to become one of the most widely read psychiatrists of the 20th century. He taught and lectured across the world. He remarried a woman named Ellie, who became his lifelong partner and closest friend. He built a life of extraordinary richness and purpose from the ruins of a life destroyed. Man's Search for Meaning has sold over 16 million copies. It has been translated into more than 50 languages. The United States Library of Congress listed it as one of the 10 most influential books in America. But none of that is the point. The point is a man in the mud, in the dark, thinking of his wife's eyes. A man who looked at a burning sunset from inside a prison and felt, against all reason, that life was still beautiful. A man who chose, 1,000 times, in circumstances that made choice seem like a cruel joke, to remain free on the inside. That is the point. I want to leave you with something Viktor Frankl wrote, not as a comforting conclusion, as a challenge. Live as if you were living already for the second time and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. Read that again slowly in your own mind. What he is asking is this: if you could stand at the end of your life and look back, what would you wish you had done differently? What would you wish you had faced more honestly? What meaning would you wish you had chosen instead of the comfortable numbness you settled for? You don't have to answer that out loud, but sit with it, because Viktor Frankl is right. The question is not theoretical. It is not hypothetical. It is happening now. This moment, this one, is the moment you are living, and the way you live it is an answer. Viktor Frankl walked out of the worst place in human history with something still burning inside him. What is still burning inside you? If this conversation about meaning, suffering, and the interior life has opened something in you, share it. Not for the algorithm, but because someone in your life might need to hear it. Someone who is marching through their own darkness, looking for a why. Give it to them. Thank you for staying until the end. Viktor Frankl would say, the fact that you stayed, that something in this held you, that is already your answer.